The gala hall was loud with laughter and clinking glasses when Elena Whitfield saw the necklace and forgot how to breathe. It hung from the neck of a man she had never met, a plain silver chain with a small hammered pendant shaped like a crescent moon. She knew that pendant. She had watched a jeweler make it by hand 7 years ago, a wedding gift from her husband's mother, one of a kind, never copied, never sold. She had placed that same pendant around her husband's neck the morning of his funeral. She had watched the coffin close around it. And now it was here, in a crowded ballroom, resting against the collar of a stranger's rented tuxedo. Elena set her champagne glass down so hard the stem cracked between her fingers. A drop of blood welled up on her palm, and she did not notice it. Her eyes were fixed on the man across the room, a tall figure with tired shoulders, lifting a small girl onto his hip so she could see the auction stage better. He laughed at something the child whispered in his ear, and the pendant swung forward and caught the light again. Elena's assistant, Marcus, appeared at her elbow with a napkin for her hand. She did not take it. "Who is that man?" she said. Her voice came out flat, stripped of the practiced warmth she used at every one of these events. Marcus followed her gaze. "That's Noah Bennett. He works at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the old distribution warehouse. He's on the guest list as a +1. One of the hospital volunteers brought him. Why?" Elena did not answer. She was already walking toward him, weaving through the crowd with the kind of purpose that made people step aside without knowing why. Noah noticed her before she reached him. Most people did. Elena Whitfield was not a woman who entered a room quietly, not because she tried to draw attention, but because 6 years of running a company worth more than some countries had taught her how to carry herself, so that rooms simply adjusted around her. He shifted the little girl on his hip, uncertain, the way people got when they suspected they were about to be asked to leave somewhere they didn't belong. "That's a beautiful necklace," Elena said. She kept her tone light. Practiced. Nothing in her face gave away the fact that her heart was slamming against her ribs like something trying to escape. Noah's hand went to his collar, an old habit, quick and unconscious. "Thank you. It was a gift." "From who, if you don't mind me asking?" Something closed in his eyes, a door shutting fast before anyone could see what was behind it. "It's a long story," he said. "Sorry, I should get her to bed. It's past her bedtime already." He nodded toward the girl on his hip, who was watching Elena with wide, curious eyes. "Of course," Elena said, stepping back, letting him go. But her mind was already running through everything she knew, which was almost nothing, and everything she needed to know, which was everything. She watched him carry the girl out through the side doors, watched the pendant catch the light one final time before it disappeared into the dark, and she stood very still in the middle of the party, surrounded by 200 people who had no idea that the ground had just opened up beneath her. Her husband, Daniel Whitfield, had died 6 years ago in a car accident on a rain-soaked highway outside the city. The car had gone off the road at high speed and into the river below. It had taken rescue teams 3 days to recover the vehicle. The body inside had been burned beyond easy recognition, identified through dental records, and the wedding ring still fused to what remained of his hand. Elena had buried him in a closed casket because there had been nothing left to show the world, only enough left to bury. And she had placed that necklace on him herself. She remembered the weight of it in her palm before she fastened the clasp. She remembered thinking that even in death, he should carry something his mother had made for him. So how was that necklace now hanging around the neck of a stranger, alive and well, and standing in a ballroom with a little girl on his hip? There were only 2 possibilities Elena could think of, and both of them terrified her. Either the necklace had been sold or stolen sometime after the funeral, passed through hands until it landed, by pure and impossible coincidence, on a man attending the same charity gala she had organized in her husband's name. Or the necklace had never been buried at all. Elena went home that night and did not sleep. She sat in the study that had once been Daniel's, surrounded by the photographs she had never had the heart to take down, and she stared at a picture of her husband smiling on their wedding day, the pendant resting against his collarbone, glinting the exact same way it had glinted tonight on a man she had never met. By morning, she had made a decision. She was not going to call the police. She was not going to hire a private investigator and hand this over to strangers who would treat it like a case file. Whatever this was, whatever it meant, she needed to understand it herself before anyone else got involved. Because if there was even the smallest chance that the necklace had a story attached to it that involved her husband, she needed to know that story before the world did. She had her assistant find the address of the coffee shop where Noah Bennett worked. 2 blocks from an old distribution warehouse that, she realized with a strange twist in her stomach, used to belong to one of Daniel's smaller companies before it was sold off after his death. The next morning, Elena Whitfield walked into a coffee shop she had never set foot in before, wearing a coat plain enough that no one recognized her, and ordered a coffee she had no intention of drinking. She sat in the corner booth and watched Noah Bennett work behind the counter, wiping down tables, calling out orders in a voice that was tired but kind, laughing at something a regular customer said. He looked nothing like a man hiding a dangerous secret. He looked like a man barely keeping his head above water, the way most single parents did, running on coffee and stubbornness and love for a child who clearly adored him. The little girl from the party was there too, doing homework at a small table near the window, humming quietly to herself as she worked. Elena recognized the tune before she consciously placed it. It was a lullaby, off-key in the exact same places, the exact same way Daniel used to sing it when he thought no one was listening. Elena's hands went cold around her coffee cup. She had heard that lullaby exactly twice in her life. Once from her husband, humming it in the shower, embarrassed when she caught him. And once, years before that, from a recording her mother-in-law had kept of Daniel as a small boy, singing along to a song his own mother used to hum while she worked in the kitchen. There was no way a stranger's daughter should know that song. No way at all. Elena did not approach them that day. She sat in the corner booth until her untouched coffee went cold, and then she left, walked 3 blocks in the wrong direction before she remembered where her car was parked, and sat behind the wheel for 20 minutes without starting the engine. Something was very wrong here, and every instinct she had told her it went far deeper than a lost necklace and a familiar song. She thought of the burned wreckage in the river. She thought of the closed casket. She thought of 6 years of grief that had shaped every decision she had made since, every late night at the office, every empty chair at every dinner, every version of herself she had built out of the wreckage of losing the only person she had ever fully trusted. If there was even the smallest possibility that something about Daniel's death had not been what it seemed, she was not going to rest until she understood what that possibility actually meant. She started coming back to the coffee shop the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. She told herself it was research. She told herself she was simply a woman who had developed a taste for average coffee in a shop across town. She did not tell herself the truth, which was that some small, foolish, aching part of her kept hoping that if she watched long enough, she would understand how a dead man's necklace had ended up around a stranger's neck, and that somewhere in that understanding, she might find a piece of her husband she thought she had lost forever. Noah began to notice her. It was hard not to. She always sat in the same corner booth, always ordered the same coffee, and never seemed to actually drink it. One afternoon, when the shop had emptied out and his daughter was absorbed in a coloring book at her usual table, he walked over and set a fresh cup down in front of Elena without being asked. "You've been coming in a lot," he said, not accusing, just curious, in the tired, straightforward way of a man who did not have the energy left over for games. "Everything okay?" Elena looked up at him, and for a moment she almost told him everything: the necklace, the lullaby, her husband, the impossible math of it all. But something held her back, some old cautious instinct built over years of boardrooms and negotiations, the part of her that knew you never showed your whole hand before you understood what game you were playing. "I like the coffee," she said instead, "and the quiet." Noah's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't far from it either. "It's not that quiet with her around," he said, nodding toward his daughter, who had looked up from her coloring book and was watching them both with the unblinking attention that only small children seemed capable of. "What's her name?" Elena asked, though she already knew. "Lily," Noah said, and something in his voice softened when he said it, something protective and worn smooth by years of practice. "She's 6. She's beautiful," Elena said, and meant it, and felt something twist painfully in her chest when she said it, because Lily had her husband's eyes. Not similar eyes, not eyes that could be explained away by coincidence. The exact same shade of gray-blue that Elena had looked into every night for the 11 years of her marriage, the exact same shape, the exact same way they crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled. Elena drove home that night gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached, and she did not stop shaking until she was standing in her own kitchen with the lights off, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of a puzzle that refused to resolve into any picture she could accept. There was only one conclusion left standing after she had eliminated every other impossible explanation, and it was the one she had been refusing to look at directly since the moment she saw that necklace glinting under the ballroom lights. Somehow, some way, some part of her husband had survived that crash 6 years ago, and somehow that survival was tangled up with a tired single father, a 6-year-old girl with her dead husband's eyes, and a secret that had been buried far deeper than any coffin. Elena did not sleep again that night. She sat at her kitchen table until the sun came up, staring at a single question that refused to let her go. If Daniel was somehow connected to all of this, why had no one ever told her? And more than that, more painfully than that, why had he let her bury an empty casket and spend 6 years grieving a man who might, somehow, impossibly, still be alive? Elena did not go to the coffee shop the next morning. Instead, she went to a small office in the financial district that belonged to a man named Victor Adeyemi, a private investigator she had used exactly once before, years ago, to check the background of a business partner who had turned out to be exactly as dishonest as she suspected. Victor was careful, quiet, and did not ask questions he did not need answered. "I need everything on a man named Noah Bennett," Elena said, sliding a folder across the desk with the little she had gathered herself. Where he came from, what he did before he worked at a coffee shop. Anything about a daughter named Lily, including where she was born and who her mother was. Victor studied the folder, then studied Elena's face, which had none of its usual composure left in it. "This isn't about a business deal," he said. "No," Elena said. "It's about my husband." Victor did not ask anything further. He simply nodded and told her he would have something within a week. The week that followed was the longest of Elena's life since the week after the crash. She went through the motions of running her company, sitting in meetings she barely absorbed, signing documents she read twice without retaining a single word. Marcus noticed. He had worked closely enough with her for 4 years to recognize when something had knocked her off balance, and he was wise enough not to ask directly. "You've been distracted," he said one afternoon, setting a stack of contracts on her desk. "Is everything all right?" "I'm working through something personal," Elena said. "I'll be back to normal soon." She was not certain that was true. Normal had stopped making sense the night she saw that necklace. Victor called her on the 6th day and asked her to come to his office in person rather than discuss it over the phone. That alone told Elena the news was heavier than she had prepared herself for. "Noah Bennett," Victor said, sliding a thin file across the desk. "Used to work for a private security firm called Ashgrove Protective Services. Before that, military service, honorably discharged. He left the security firm abruptly 6 years ago, around the same time your husband died. There's very little public record of why. His employment history goes quiet for almost 8 months after that, then picks back up at a different, much smaller security company for less than a year, and then he leaves that industry entirely and starts working service jobs. He's been doing that ever since." Elena's pulse was loud in her own ears. "And the daughter?" Victor hesitated, which was unlike him. This is where it gets difficult to explain. There is no birth certificate on file for a child named Lily Bennett, born to Noah Bennett as a biological parent. There is, however, a legal guardianship filing dated 7 months after your husband's accident, granting Noah Bennett custody of a child whose birth records were sealed by court order. I was not able to access what's behind that seal without raising flags I did not think you wanted raised." Elena sat very still, staring at the papers in front of her without truly seeing them. "There's one more thing," Victor said, quieter now. "The private security firm Bennett worked for, Ashgrove Protective Services, had a contract 6 years ago, a confidential personal protection contract. I couldn't get the client's name. It's buried under layers of non-disclosure agreements that would take a court order to break. But the contract dates line up almost exactly with the weeks leading up to your husband's accident." The room seemed to tilt slightly around Elena. "Are you telling me my husband hired a private security team before he died?" "I'm telling you," Victor said carefully, "that someone did, and the dates line up close enough that I would be doing you a disservice not to mention it." Elena left Victor's office with more questions than she had walked in with, which she had not thought possible. She drove without any real destination in mind, and found herself, an hour later, parked outside the coffee shop again, watching through the window as Noah closed up for the night, flipping the sign from open to closed, scooping Lily up onto his shoulders so she could reach the light switch by the door, both of them laughing about something Elena could not hear through the glass. She thought about walking in and demanding answers. She thought about it for a long time, sitting in her car with her hands on the wheel, engine off, watching a man and a little girl who might be carrying the biggest secret of her entire life without even fully understanding it themselves. Instead, she waited until they left, and she followed them home at a careful distance, the way she imagined a much less dignified version of herself might have done in some other life, some life where she wasn't the head of a company worth billions of dollars, but simply a woman who had lost her husband and refused to believe the loss was as final as everyone had told her it was. They lived in a small rented house on a quiet street, the kind of house with a porch light that flickered, and a lawn that needed mowing, and a bicycle with training wheels leaned against the front steps. Elena parked across the street and watched the lights come on inside, one room at a time, until the house settled into the soft yellow glow of a bedtime routine she recognized from a life she used to imagine having with Daniel before everything fell apart. She did not go home that night until well past midnight, and when she finally did, she went straight to the locked drawer in Daniel's old study, the one she had not opened since the year after the funeral, and pulled out the box of his personal effects that had been returned to her after the investigation closed. Wallet, melted beyond use. A watch, stopped at the exact time investigators believed the crash occurred, and a folder of paperwork she had never had the strength to read in full, files from his company that his lawyer had insisted she keep in case of future disputes over the estate. She read through every page that night. Most of it was standard business material, contracts and shareholder agreements and things that meant nothing to her grief 6 years ago. But near the bottom of the folder, tucked behind an insurance document, she found a single handwritten note in her husband's handwriting, dated 3 weeks before the crash. It was short, only a few lines, but it named a company Elena had never heard of, a company that, according to a quick search on her phone, had been quietly absorbed into a much larger conglomerate 2 years after Daniel's death. And at the bottom of the note, underlined twice, was a single sentence that made Elena's blood run cold. "If anything happens to me, protect them. Do not let them find her." There was no name attached to the word her. No explanation, just those 7 words, written in her husband's careful hand, sitting in a folder that had been in her possession for 6 years, without her ever knowing they were there. Elena sat at her kitchen table until the sky outside began to lighten, holding that piece of paper like it might dissolve if she gripped it too hard, trying to understand what her husband had known, who he had been afraid of, and whether the little girl with his exact eyes, humming his mother's lullaby in a coffee shop across town, was the her he had been trying so desperately to protect. By the time morning came, Elena had made a decision. She was done watching from a distance. She was done circling the truth like a woman afraid to touch a live wire. Whatever this was, Whatever it meant for her husband, for herself, for the little girl who might be the missing piece of a puzzle 6 years in the making, she needed to hear it directly from the one person who seemed to be holding every answer without realizing it. She was going to talk to Noah Bennett, and this time, she was not going to leave without the truth. She arrived at the coffee shop just before closing, when the last customers had drifted out and Lily was tucked into the corner booth finishing a glass of milk, her small feet swinging beneath the table in a rhythm that matched nothing in particular. Noah looked up when the bell over the door rang, and something in his expression shifted the moment he saw Elena's face, the careful blankness gone, replaced by an expression far too serious for a woman who supposedly just liked average coffee. "We need to talk," Elena said, and her voice did not shake even though everything inside her did. "About the necklace. About Lily. And about my husband." Noah went very still behind the counter, one hand rising slowly to touch the pendant at his throat, and for the first time since Elena had started watching him, she saw real fear cross his face. The fear of a man who had spent years guarding a secret and had just watched someone walk through the door who already knew far too much of it. "I think," he said quietly, glancing at his daughter, then back at Elena, "you'd better sit down." He asked one of his part-time workers, a young woman named Priya, who was wiping down the espresso machine, to walk Lily home and stay with her for an hour. Lily protested for exactly 3 seconds before Priya mentioned something about a movie waiting on the television, and then the little girl bounced out the door with her backpack half-zipped, leaving Noah and Elena alone in a coffee shop that suddenly felt much too quiet. Noah locked the front door, flipped the sign, and pulled 2 chairs down from where they had been stacked on a table for closing. He did not sit right away. He stood by the window for a long moment, looking out at the street, and Elena had the strange sense that he was working up the courage to say something he had never said out loud to anyone. "How much do you already know?" he asked finally, still facing the window. "I know that necklace belonged to my husband," Elena said. "I know I put it on him myself, before his funeral. I know your employment records go quiet around the exact time he died, and that before that, you worked for a security firm with a confidential protection contract that lines up with the weeks leading up to his crash. And I know that Lily has his eyes, Noah. Not similar eyes. His eyes." Noah closed his eyes briefly, like a man bracing for impact, and then he finally sat down across from her. "My name wasn't always Noah Bennett," he said. "That's not a lie I'm proud of, but it's the truth. 6 years ago, I was part of a private protection detail. We didn't usually take personal clients, mostly corporate security, executive protection during high-risk negotiations, that kind of work. But one contract came through that was different. Higher pay than usual, strict confidentiality, and the client wanted round-the-clock coverage without anyone at his own company knowing about it." "That client was my husband," Elena said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Noah said. "Daniel Whitfield hired us 3 months before the accident. He told my supervisor he believed someone inside his own company was feeding sensitive information to a competitor, and that he suspected it went beyond corporate espionage. He believed someone was willing to hurt people to protect what they were hiding. He never told us exactly what that information was. He was careful, almost too careful, but he was afraid, Elena. I want you to understand that. He wasn't a paranoid man imagining shadows. Something real was chasing him, and he knew it." Elena's hands were pressed flat against the table, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. "Go on." 3 weeks before the crash, he asked to speak with me directly, not through my supervisor. He said he trusted me because I hadn't gone through the interview process the same way the others had. I'd been added late, and whoever was watching him from the inside wouldn't have had time to compromise me the way he suspected they might have compromised the others on the detail. Noah rubbed a hand over his face. "He told me he was pregnant, not him, you. He said you were carrying a child, and that he was terrified whoever was after him would use that child against him, or against you, once the baby was born and impossible to hide." Elena felt something crack open in her chest, an old grief she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it belonged to someone else. She had been pregnant when Daniel died. She had lost the baby 3 weeks after the funeral, in the middle of the worst month of her life, and she had never told anyone outside of her closest doctor and her own private heartbreak. She had assumed, all these years, that the loss of the baby had been hers alone to carry, one more piece of wreckage from that terrible year that nobody else needed to know about. "I lost that baby," she whispered. Noah's face went pale, in a way that told Elena he had not expected this piece of the story to still be a wound. "That's what everyone was told," he said slowly. "That's what your doctor's office recorded. That's what your husband arranged." The room seemed to tilt again, the way it had in Victor's office, the floor no longer entirely solid beneath her. "What are you saying?" Elena said, and her voice had lost every trace of its careful composure now. Noah reached up and unclasped the necklace from around his throat, setting it gently on the table between them, the little crescent moon pendant catching the dim light of the closed shop. "3 weeks before the crash," he said, "Daniel came to me privately and told me he had a plan. He believed the threat against him was escalating fast, faster than his security team could contain through normal means. He believed that if the people after him ever learned you were pregnant, they would use the baby as leverage, either to control him or to hurt you both. He told me he was going to fake an emergency delivery, months ahead of the real due date recorded in his official medical files, quietly, through a private doctor he trusted completely, someone who had delivered his own sister's children years before, and who owed him a debt he trusted absolutely. He said if the baby was born and immediately reported as lost, if there was a private, quiet, believable story of a stillbirth, then no one hunting him would ever think to look for a child at all." Elena stared at him. The room had gone completely silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. "He was terrified something was going to happen to him," Noah continued. "He told me that if anything did happen, if he died before he could see this plan through properly, he needed someone he trusted completely to take the baby somewhere far away from his world, somewhere none of his enemies would ever think to look, and raise her as their own until it was safe to bring her home. He asked me to be that person. Not because I had any experience raising a child. I didn't. I was 26 years old and had never so much as changed a diaper. But he said he trusted me because I had nothing to gain from betraying him. No stake in his company, no history that could be traced back to Ashgrove that would connect me to him if anyone came looking." "And you agreed," Elena said. Her voice had gone very small. "I agreed," Noah said. "I thought it would never actually happen. I thought it was a contingency plan, one of 100 things frightened rich men imagine in the middle of the night that never actually come to pass. And then 3 weeks later he was dead, and the plan he had built for a hypothetical disaster became the only thing standing between a newborn baby and whatever was hunting her father." Elena pressed both hands over her mouth, and for a long moment she could not speak at all. "The crash," she finally managed. "Was it really an accident?" Noah's jaw tightened. "I don't know for certain. I was not with him that night. He had dismissed his detail early, said he needed privacy to handle something personal. I've spent 6 years wondering the same thing you're wondering right now. Whether it really was a rain-slick road and bad luck, or whether someone finally caught up with him before he could finish protecting the people he loved. I have never been able to prove it either way, and believe me, I've tried." "And the baby," Elena said, forcing the words out even though every part of her was screaming to stop, to run, to never hear the answer. "Where is she?" Noah looked at her for a long moment, and then he said the words as gently as he possibly could. "Elena, Lily is your daughter." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an entire lifetime. The private doctor delivered her early, exactly the way Daniel arranged, Noah said. It happened faster than anyone expected. Daniel died 2 days after she was born, before he ever got to hold her the way he wanted to, before he could tell you the truth himself, before any of the plan he had built could unfold the way he intended. I was supposed to be a temporary guardian, someone holding the pieces together for a few weeks until Daniel found a safer way to bring you both back together. Instead, I became the only person standing between a newborn and a world that I still, to this day, do not fully understand the danger of. I took her and I ran, and I have spent 6 years being terrified every single day that someone would eventually find us, and terrified in an entirely different way that I was keeping a mother from her own child. Elena's hands were shaking so badly she had to press them against the table to steady them. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me the moment it was safe?" "Because I never knew when it was safe," Noah said, and for the first time his voice cracked with something raw underneath the careful composure he had clearly practiced for 6 long years. "I didn't know who Daniel was afraid of. I didn't know if it was someone inside his own company, someone in his personal life, someone with enough money and enough reach to still be watching 6 years later. Every year that went by without anything happening made it a little easier to convince myself that maybe it was finally safe, and every year I got a little more terrified that the moment I came forward, I would be putting her directly back in danger. And there was another part of it too, a part I'm not proud of. She became my daughter, Elena, not in blood, but in every single way that has ever mattered to me. I have raised her since she was 11 days old. I have been the one there for every fever, every nightmare, every single first step and first word and first day of school. The longer I waited, the harder it became to imagine handing her back to a world I did not know how to trust. Elena reached across the table with a hand that trembled and picked up the necklace, turning it over between her fingers, feeling the same careful hammer marks she remembered from the jeweler's workshop 7 years ago. "He gave you this," she said quietly. "The night he told me the plan," Noah said. "He said it was his mother's, and that someday, when it was finally safe, I should give it to Lily, so she would have something of her father's, even if she never got the chance to know him. I've worn it every single day since, because I was terrified of losing it, and because some nights it felt like the only proof I had that any of this was real and not some story I had made up in my own head to explain the impossible weight of the life I was suddenly responsible for." Elena set the necklace down gently and looked up at him, and in his face she saw something she had not expected to see underneath all of the fear and secrecy, something that looked almost like relief, like a man finally setting down a weight he had carried alone for 6 years, far too long. "I need to see her," Elena said. "I need to see my daughter." Noah nodded slowly. "I know. But Elena, I need you to understand something first. Whatever was hunting Daniel 6 years ago, we still don't know if it's gone. If we do this wrong, if we do this too fast, too publicly, we could be putting her in exactly the kind of danger he died trying to protect her from. I've kept her safe for 6 years by staying invisible. I don't know how to keep her safe if the whole world suddenly finds out who she really is." Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, forcing her voice steady even though everything inside her had shattered and was slowly, carefully, trying to rebuild itself into some new shape she did not yet understand. "Then we figure out how to do it carefully," she said. "Together. Because I am not losing another 6 years, Noah. Not with her. Not after everything this has already cost me." Outside the coffee shop window, the street lights flickered on one by one against the darkening sky, and somewhere across town, in a small rented house with a flickering porch light, a 6-year-old girl, with her father's eyes, was falling asleep without any idea that the woman who had been quietly watching her for weeks was about to become the most important person in her entire life. They agreed to move slowly. Elena would visit as a family friend first, someone Lily could grow familiar with before anyone attempted to explain the truth of who she really was to a 6-year-old who had never known anything different than the life Noah had built for her. Elena canceled meetings she had never once canceled in 4 years running her company, ignored calls from board members who had grown used to her answering within minutes, and spent every free hour she had sitting on the floor of a small rented living room, building block towers with a little girl who called her Miss Elena and asked, with unbearable innocence, whether she liked to color inside the lines or outside them. Elena had never colored outside the lines in her life. Within a week, Lily had taught her otherwise. But underneath the careful, tender rebuilding of a life Elena had never known she was allowed to want, Victor Adeyemi's investigation had not stopped. He called Elena on a Tuesday evening with a voice tighter than she had ever heard it. "I found the client behind that old security contract," he said. "The one that hired Ashgrove Protective Services 6 years ago. The one that lines up with your husband's death." Elena gripped the phone hard enough to feel her own pulse in her fingers. Who was it? "It wasn't Daniel," Victor said. "It was filed under a shell company, but I traced the payments back through 3 layers of holding accounts. The money came from Preston Hale." The name landed like a physical blow. Preston Hale had been Daniel's closest friend since business school, the executive vice president of Whitfield's rival conglomerate, a man who had sat across from Elena at her own husband's funeral with tears in his eyes and had continued, in the years since, to send flowers on the anniversary of Daniel's death. A man Elena trusted enough that she had let him serve on the board of the Children's Hospital Foundation, established in Daniel's name. "That can't be right," Elena said, though even as she said it, a cold certainty was settling into her stomach, the kind of certainty that arrives not because evidence has convinced you, but because some part of you had suspected it all along and simply refused to look directly at the thought. "I wish I could tell you it was a mistake," Victor said, "but the paper trail is clean. Preston Hale hired the security firm your husband was working with, under a false name, monitoring the exact detail assigned to protect Daniel. I believe he was tracking Daniel's movements the entire time, likely trying to determine what Daniel knew and who he had told." Elena thought of Daniel's handwritten note, the one she had found tucked in that folder 6 years too late. "If anything happens to me, protect them. Do not let them find her." She had assumed "them" referred to some faceless corporate enemy, an abstraction easy enough to fear from a distance. She had never imagined it might be a man who had stood beside her at the graveside, who had held her hand while she wept, who had spent 6 years pretending to grieve a friend he may have helped destroy. "Why?" Elena whispered. "Why would he do this?" "I don't have a confirmed motive yet," Victor said. "But there's a pattern. In the 2 years after your husband's death, Preston Hale's company acquired 3 smaller firms that had previously been under contract negotiation with Whitfield Industries, all at prices well below market value, all under circumstances that would have been very different if your husband had lived to finish those deals himself. Whatever your husband suspected about information leaking from inside his own company, I believe he was right, and I believe Preston Hale was the one leaking it." Elena sat with the phone pressed against her ear for a long time after Victor had said everything he needed to say, staring at nothing, feeling the careful, hopeful new shape of her life threaten to collapse in on itself before it had even fully finished forming. She called Noah that same night, and when she told him what Victor had found, she heard him go completely silent on the other end of the line for so long she thought the call had dropped. "Preston Hale," he finally said, and there was something strange and heavy in his voice. "I need to show you something. Come over. Now, please." Elena drove faster than she should have, and when she arrived, Noah was waiting on the porch with a small metal lockbox in his hands, the kind of box people use to keep important documents safe from fire or theft. He led her inside, past a sleeping Lily's bedroom door, into the small kitchen, and set the box down on the table. "After Daniel died," he said, "before I left the security firm for good, I took a few things from the case file. I wasn't supposed to. I could have gone to prison for it if anyone had ever found out, but something told me I might need proof someday of what really happened, in case anyone ever tried to pretend Daniel had simply been paranoid, or worse, in case anyone ever tried to make it look like I had done something wrong by taking Lily." He opened the box and pulled out a small stack of photographs, surveillance images, dated timestamps in the corner. Elena leaned closer, and her breath caught. The photographs showed Daniel, weeks before his death, meeting privately with a man in a parking garage. The man's face was turned slightly away in most of the images, but in one, taken from a different angle, his profile was unmistakable. Preston Hale. "There's more," Noah said, pulling out a small folded piece of paper, brittle with age. This was recovered from the wreckage of the car. It's not in the official report. My supervisor pulled it before the police processed the scene, because Daniel had told him, if anything ever happened, to make sure certain documents never disappeared into evidence lockers where they could quietly vanish. It's a financial ledger, handwritten. Daniel's numbers, tracking payments he believed were being funneled out of Whitfield Industries through a series of shell accounts. At the bottom, there's a name. Elena unfolded the paper with trembling hands and saw her husband's familiar, cramped handwriting, columns of numbers, dates, and at the very bottom, underlined twice, in the same way as the note she had already found. PH knows. Confront tomorrow. If I don't come home, Elena needs to see this. The date was the day before the crash. Elena sat down heavily in one of Noah's kitchen chairs, the ledger shaking in her hands. He was going to confront him, she whispered. The day after this was written, he died. I think, Noah said quietly, your husband figured out exactly what Preston Hale was doing, and I think he made the mistake of telling him he knew, before he had any protection in place to survive the conversation. Elena closed her eyes, and for a long, terrible moment, 6 years of grief reorganized itself into something sharper and more dangerous than grief had ever felt before. It was no longer only sadness. It was fury, cold and clear, and entirely new, aimed at a man who had smiled at her across 100 dinner tables while quietly wearing the mask of her husband's murderer. We need to be careful, Noah said, watching her face. If Preston Hale finds out that Lily exists, that she's alive, that there's a ledger connecting him directly to Daniel's death, he will not hesitate to protect himself. A man who was willing to do this once will not think twice about doing it again if he believes his freedom depends on it. Then we go to the authorities, Elena said. Tonight, before he has any idea we know. With what? Noah said gently. A stolen ledger, some old surveillance photos, and a story about a faked stillbirth that could get me arrested the moment anyone official hears it. Elena, if we go in too fast, too clumsy, we risk losing everything, the case against him and custody of Lily both. We need this done right, carefully, with lawyers who know how to protect all three of us while this comes out. Elena looked toward the hallway where Lily's bedroom door stood slightly open, a small nightlight glowing faintly from within, and something inside her steadied even through the fury, because she understood, in that moment, that protecting her daughter mattered more than the satisfaction of moving fast. Okay, she said, we do this carefully. But Noah, I promise you, Preston Hale is going to pay for what he did to my husband, and he is never, ever getting anywhere near my daughter. Neither of them noticed. In the tension of that late-night kitchen conversation, the dark sedan that had been parked 2 houses down the street for the better part of an hour, its engine idling quietly in the dark, its driver watching the glow of the kitchen window with patient, unhurried attention. The break-in never happened. Elena would later be grateful, for the rest of her life, that Noah had installed cheap motion sensor lights around the small rented house years earlier, a habit born of 6 years of quiet paranoia that had never once been tested until the night it mattered most. The lights snapped on at 2 in the morning, flooding the yard in white, and the dark sedan pulled away from the curb before anyone inside the house had even fully woken. Noah was already moving before Elena understood what was happening, pulling Lily from her bed half asleep and confused, wrapping her in a blanket, ushering both of them into the car with the quiet, practiced efficiency of a man who had once trained for exactly this kind of moment and had hoped, every single day since, that he would never need to use that training again. We need somewhere safe, he said, pulling out onto the street, checking his mirrors with attention Elena had never seen in him before, somewhere off any record connected to either of us. Elena thought fast, the executive part of her brain finally proving useful for something other than boardrooms. My grandmother's cabin, she said, 2 hours north. It's held under a trust with a different name. It was never connected to Daniel's public records. No one would think to look there. They drove through the dark, intense silence, Lily eventually falling back asleep against the blanket in the back seat, entirely unaware of how close the night had come to becoming something far worse than a strange, sudden car ride. Elena called Victor from the road, her voice low so as not to wake her daughter, and gave him everything: the ledger, the photographs, the name. "I need you to get this to someone who can act on it fast," she said. "Someone outside of Preston Hale's reach. Federal, if you have to. Elena Whitfield does not care anymore about quiet or careful. I care about my daughter being safe." Victor did not hesitate. Within hours, working through contacts built over a long career of careful, discreet investigation, he had the ledger and photographs in the hands of a federal financial crimes unit already quietly circling irregularities in Preston Hale's company for reasons entirely unrelated to Daniel's death. It turned out Hale's pattern of underpriced acquisitions had drawn regulatory attention over a year earlier, an investigation moving slowly through corporate paperwork that suddenly found itself handed a motive, a body, and a timeline that connected every loose thread investigators had been chasing without success. Preston Hale was arrested 4 days later, at his office, in front of the same board members who had once shaken Elena's hand at Daniel's funeral. The financial trail Daniel had assembled before his death, combined with the surveillance photographs and the timeline of the crash, gave prosecutors more than enough to build a case that went far beyond corporate fraud. Investigators reopened the file on the crash itself, and evidence long buried under a closed case number began to resurface. A tampered brake line report that had been quietly dismissed 6 years earlier as inconclusive, now examined again with fresh eyes and far more serious questions attached to it. Elena did not attend the arrest. She stayed at the cabin with Noah and Lily, sitting on the porch in the cold morning air, watching her daughter chase a stray cat across the overgrown lawn, laughing in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with simply being 6 years old on an unexpected little adventure with the people who loved her. "It's over," Noah said quietly, sitting down beside her. "Or at least, the dangerous part is." "Is it?" Elena said. "I don't know how to feel about any of this. I'm relieved. I'm furious. I'm grieving a husband all over again, except now I'm grieving him for a different reason, because he never got the chance to tell me any of this himself, because he spent his last weeks alive trying to protect us both, and I never even got to say goodbye to the man who did that." Noah was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," he finally said, "I think he'd be glad, not about how it happened, but about where you both ended up." Elena looked out at Lily, who had abandoned the cat chase and was now attempting, with great seriousness, to build a small pile of rocks into something she was calling a castle. "I want to tell her the truth," Elena said. "Not today, not even this year maybe, but someday, when she's old enough to understand it. I want her to know who her father was, and what he sacrificed, and how much he loved her before she was even born." "And what about us?" Noah asked, careful, uncertain, the question of a man who had spent 6 years defining his entire identity around being someone's father, and did not yet know what came next, now that the secret keeping them apart had finally broken open. Elena considered the question honestly, the way she considered every important decision in her life, weighing it from every possible angle before she allowed herself to answer. "I think," she said slowly, "we figure it out together. Not as strangers who share an impossible secret. As a family, however strange the shape of it turns out to be. Lily needs both of us. And honestly, Noah, after everything you did, after everything you sacrificed to keep her safe for 6 years, without asking anything for yourself, I don't think I could imagine my life without you in it now, even if I tried." Noah's throat worked for a moment before he managed to speak. "I was so afraid," he admitted, "that the day the truth came out, I would lose her, that you'd take her and disappear into a life I could never be part of." "I would never do that," Elena said. "You didn't steal my daughter from me, Noah. You saved her. There's a difference, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you know exactly how grateful I am for it." Preston Hale's trial, months later, brought the full truth into public record: the years of corporate theft, the surveillance, the confrontation Daniel had walked into unprepared, and the tampered brake line that had finally been confirmed through forensic re-examination. Elena sat through every day of it, her back straight, her daughter's small hand held tightly in her own during the parts appropriate for a child to hear, and when the verdict came down, guilty on every count, she felt something in her chest finally settle after 6 years of unanswered questions. Life afterward did not become simple, not immediately. There were legal matters to resolve, formal guardianship paperwork to file correctly this time, careful conversations with therapists about how and when to help a young girl understand a truth this large. Lily eventually learned, in pieces, gently, over the following 2 years, that Miss Elena was in fact her mother, that Noah was still her father in every single way that had ever mattered, and that both of these truths could exist together without canceling each other out. She took the news, in the end, with the straightforward acceptance that only children seem capable of, absorbing the enormous revision of her entire understanding of her own family with far less difficulty than either of the adults who loved her had expected. Elena kept the crescent moon pendant in a small box on her dresser for years afterward, though eventually, when Lily turned 13, she gave it to her properly, fastening the clasp around her daughter's neck the way she had once fastened it around her husband's, this time with the full weight of the story attached to it instead of 6 years of silence. "Your grandmother made this," Elena told her. "Your father wore it his whole life, and it was the very first clue that led me to you." Lily touched the pendant thoughtfully, the same unconscious gesture her father used to make, the same gesture Noah still made sometimes, out of an old habit he had never quite broken. "I'm glad you found it," Lily said simply, and went back to whatever she had been doing before, the way 13-year-olds tend to move quickly past the enormous things and back into the ordinary ones, leaving Elena standing there with tears in her eyes, thinking of a man who had given everything he had to protect a family he never got to see grow up, and grateful, endlessly grateful, for the stranger who had carried that promise forward when no one else could.